"She won't find it," the boy said, plain as sunrise, not looking up from the tin plate he was scraping clean. "I hid it under the floorboard." Abel Greer set down his coffee cup with a slow, deliberate care that a man uses when he is choosing not to shout. Across the table, his son Caleb, 6 years old, gap-toothed, entirely unashamed, finally lifted his eyes. They were his mother's eyes, dark and steady, and they held a certainty that no child that age had any business possessing. "You hid what?" Abel said. It was not quite a question. Her ticket. The return one. She keeps it in the green ribbon pouch inside her satchel. Caleb set down the spoon. She was going to leave on the Thursday stage. I heard her telling the school board man. Abel stood very still in the doorway of the kitchen while the October wind pressed against the warped wooden walls of the house and the fire in the stove ticked and sighed. Outside, he could hear the faint sound of boot heels on the porch steps. Measured, quick, purposeful. Miss Lydia Cole's boots had a particular sound to them, a woman who walked like she had a destination and intended to reach it. He had maybe 30 seconds to decide what to do with what his son had just told him. Before that autumn was over, Abel Greer would kneel in the dust of his own parlor floor and say words he had not said to another living soul in 4 years. But right now, in the last seconds before the door opened, all he did was look at his son and say, very quietly, "Put that spoon down and go wash your hands." And Caleb, not a word. The door swung open. Lydia Cole stepped inside with a stack of primers balanced against her hip and chalk dust on her sleeve, and she looked at the two of them standing there, the man with his unreadable face and the boy with his suspiciously clean expression, and she narrowed her eyes just slightly. "Good evening," she said. "Evening, Miss Cole," Abel answered. Neither of them knew, quite yet, how much had already changed. In the autumn of 1893, near the town of Harlan's Crossing in the Wyoming Territory, a school teacher arrived on the Thursday stage with a carpet bag, a crate of books, and a clear and definite plan. Lydia Cole was 28 years old. She had grown up in Cincinnati, studied at a teacher's college there, and spent 4 years teaching in a proper school with plaster walls and a bell tower. When the letter came from the Wyoming Territorial Board of Education offering a 1-year placement at the Harlan's Crossing Schoolhouse, a modest building, the letter said, currently without an instructor, she accepted for reasons she kept honest only with herself. She needed to go somewhere she had not already been, somewhere where no one would offer her condolences about the engagement that had ended, or ask careful questions about whether she was all right, or look at her the way people look at women who are nearly 30 and living again in their parents' house. She signed the contract for 1 year. She purchased a return ticket and tucked it in her green ribbon pouch, which she kept in the outside pocket of her satchel, where she could feel it whenever she reached for chalk or a handkerchief. It was her proof that she was not staying. She was passing through. Teaching was what she did. Wyoming was simply where she was doing it for now. The board's letter had mentioned, in its final paragraph, that suitable boarding arrangements had been identified. A local rancher, recently widowed, had offered the use of a spare room in exchange for assistance with household correspondence. He was, the letter said diplomatically, a man of practical rather than literary inclination. His young son was already enrolled in her class. The arrangement was mutually beneficial, the letter said. Mutually beneficial. Lydia had underlined those words with a faint appreciation for their efficiency. She was practical herself. Abel Greer met her at the stage stop with a wagon and very few words. He was taller than she expected, broad across the shoulders in the manner of a man who had built things with his hands over many years, and he had the unhurried quality of someone who had long since decided that talking more than necessary was a waste of air. He loaded her crate of books into the wagon without being asked. He helped her up to the seat with a steadying hand that was gone the moment she was settled. He told her the ride to the ranch was 4 miles and the road was passable. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate directness." He looked at her sideways. "I don't have much else to offer." "That," Lydia said, settling her bag across her knees, "is exactly what I mean." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. The horse started moving. The grass on either side of the road was October gold, and the sky above the territory was a particular shade of blue that Lydia had not seen in Ohio, very wide and very serious, and she found herself breathing it in before she thought to stop herself. At the house, Caleb was waiting on the porch steps. He was small and dark-eyed, and he studied her with the frank assessment of a child who has decided to form his own opinions. "Are you the teacher?" he asked. "I am," she said. "Pa said you were coming from Cincinnati." He considered this. "Is Cincinnati nice?" "It is perfectly fine," Lydia told him. "Have you done your letters this week?" He had not. His silence confirmed. She made a note to herself. The boy had her full attention by the time she reached the porch, which was exactly what he had been angling for, though she did not yet know that about him. Abel carried her crate inside. He showed her the room, small, clean, a window facing east, a hook on the wall for her coat, a pitcher and basin on the stand. No frills and no apologies. "The household correspondence," she said. "Letters to creditors, suppliers, feed supplier in Cheyenne, the land office, twice a year. The Cattle Association sends notices I can't make head or tail of." He paused. "My wife, she handled it. She had schooling." "I understand," Lydia said, and she kept her voice even and did not offer condolences, because she could see from the way he said it that he did not want them. "I'll need a desk and lamp. There's one in the front room." "Then we have an arrangement, Mr. Greer." "Abel," he said. "Mr. Greer was my father." "Abel, then." She set her satchel on the bed. "And I'm Lydia. Since we'll be sharing a kitchen, we may as well not be formal about it." He nodded once. He left her to unpack. She listened to his boots on the floorboards, measuring, unhurried, growing distant, and she reached into her satchel and pressed her fingers against the green ribbon pouch, checking it was there. It was there. The first 2 weeks passed in the particular rhythm of two private people learning not to startle each other. Lydia taught school from 7 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, which gave her time to return to the ranch before dark. She sat at the desk in the front room each evening after supper and worked through Abel's accumulated correspondence in careful order. The feed supplier's invoices first, then the land office notices, then the Cattle Association's quarterly bulletins, which were dense with figures and required reading twice. She left her written responses on the desk with a brief note explaining what she had done and why. The first morning, she found he had read her note and written beside it, in large, careful print, "Good." She almost smiled. Caleb was, as she had suspected on the porch, quick. He was also easily bored, which was more dangerous in a child than slowness. He finished his reading primers 2 weeks ahead of the other students and began interrupting her lessons with tangential questions about the names of mountain ranges, about why some rivers ran fast and some ran slow, about whether there were schools in China. She answered every question. Then she gave him harder books to keep him occupied, and he accepted them with a satisfaction that told her he had been waiting to be taken seriously. In the evenings, he sometimes sat near the desk while she worked and drew horses in the margins of old envelopes. She did not shoo him away. He was quiet when he drew, which was the best version of him. Abel watched all of this without comment. He was out before dawn most days, back in the early dark of those October evenings, and he ate supper with a focused appetite that reminded Lydia of a man who had learned not to expect pleasure from meals and was therefore surprised, sometimes visibly, when the food was good. She had begun cooking, or rather, she had begun improving what he had already started, because he was a capable plain cook in the way that men who lived alone tend to be, adequate but joyless. She made a pot of beef stew on the third Tuesday with carrots she bought from the Harlan's Crossing Mercantile and dried rosemary she had packed from Cincinnati in a small tin, because she was thorough about such things. He tasted it and was quiet for a moment. "That's from home," he said. "The rosemary? Yes." He didn't say anything else. But he had a second bowl, and when he cleared his plate to the basin, he paused and said, without turning, "Good stew." Lydia kept her eyes on her correspondence and said, "Thank you." That was November's whole story, or most of it. There was a woman in town named Mrs. Pruitt who kept the mercantile and who had, Lydia discovered, a comprehensive interest in the personal arrangements of everyone within 20 miles. She appeared at the schoolhouse door one Thursday afternoon in early November, under the pretext of delivering a bolt of cloth that had been ordered by the school board. An unnecessary personal delivery, Lydia noted, since the school board would have collected it themselves. "It's a peculiar arrangement," Mrs. Pruitt said, setting the cloth on the table with a significant look. "A single woman boarding with a widower. The children's parents have mentioned it." Lydia had been erasing the board. "I'm employed by the territorial board and boarding under a written agreement that the board approved," she said. "The arrangement is both practical and documented." "Oh, I'm sure it is," Mrs. Pruitt said, in a tone that communicated the opposite. "Is there anything else you needed to drop off?" Lydia asked pleasantly. There was not. Mrs. Pruitt left with her dignity somewhat rearranged, and Lydia finished erasing the board and then stood for a moment with the eraser in her hand, thinking. She was not naive. She knew what the talk would build to if it was left to build. She also knew that she had a return ticket in a green ribbon pouch and had never intended to be the subject of anyone's small-town speculation. She had come here to teach and to recover herself quietly, and she was managing both, and she was not going to be driven out by a woman with too much cloth and too little occupation. But she told Abel that evening. She was direct about it, the way she was direct about everything, because she felt he had a right to know that his name was being tidied into the gossip. She laid it out plainly while he drank his after-supper coffee. He listened. He turned his cup in his hands. "I can speak to Reverend Hollis," he said. "Get ahead of it." "I don't require defending," she said. "I just wanted you to know." "I know you don't require it." He looked at her steadily. "I'm offering it anyway." The fire in the stove ticked. Caleb was already in bed. Outside, the first serious cold of November had moved in and was making the windows breathe. "All right," Lydia said after a moment. "All right," he repeated. It was, she thought, the most they had agreed on anything at once. What she did not tell him was that she had reached into her satchel that afternoon, checking for the pouch, and for one long, strange second she could not find it. Her hand had searched the outer pocket twice before she found it in the inner one, where she must have moved it without remembering. Her heart had done something odd in that second of not finding. Not quite relief when she located it, but something more complicated than that. Something she did not have a name for yet, and was not eager to investigate. The cold came down in earnest the second week of December, and it came with teeth. Lydia had grown up in Ohio winters and considered herself acquainted with cold, but Wyoming had different ideas. The wind out of the north was not like any wind she had known. It did not gust and relent. It simply pressed, constant and factual, like a second set of walls determined to get in. Abel spent 2 days reinforcing the barn and the chicken coop before the worst of it arrived, and she watched him from the window between her correspondence duties, working with the methodical efficiency of a man who had done this before and knew exactly how much was necessary. The third morning, she came to the kitchen to find a third log already added to the stove, and the water bucket full, and a plate of cornbread covered with a cloth on the table. She stood there for a moment in the early morning quiet. He was already out, but the stove was warm and the bread was fresh, and the gesture was so ordinary and so deliberate that she found herself having to press her lips together before she could arrange her face into something composed. Caleb appeared in his nightshirt, hair disordered, and pointed at the cornbread. "Pa got up extra early," he announced. "He said the kitchen would be cold when you woke up, and you'd need something already warm." "That was thoughtful," Lydia said. Caleb considered. He does that. He doesn't say much, but he does things. He picked up a piece of cornbread with both hands, like how he fixed the wobbly leg on your desk chair before you noticed it was wobbly. He did that the first week. Lydia poured herself coffee and sat down and thought about Abel Greer, who fixed wobbly chair legs without mentioning it, and got up early in a Wyoming December, so that a woman who was only passing through would have a warm kitchen. She graded papers that evening, and tried not to think about it. The town's discomfort with the boarding arrangement reached its practical peak just before Christmas, when the school board chairman, a heavy-set man named Fillmore, appeared at the ranch to suggest, without quite saying so directly, that it might be better for the school's standing if Lydia relocated to the boarding house in town. He managed to convey this while standing in the front room and looking at nothing in particular. Abel was the one who answered the door. Lydia was at the desk, and she watched Fillmore make his careful circling speech, and she waited to see what Abel would do. What he did was stand very quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Lydia." She looked up. "Do you want to move to the boarding house?" "No," she said. "I am comfortable here and my work is efficiently arranged." Abel turned back to Fillmore. "She's comfortable and her work is efficiently arranged," he repeated. "Thank you for coming out, Mr. Fillmore. It's a cold ride." Fillmore opened his mouth and closed it. He had a good 40 pounds on Abel and was accustomed to being the largest man in a room, but there was something in the way Abel stood, not aggressive, not threatening, simply immovable, that settled the question without another word being needed. Fillmore left. Abel closed the door. He turned and found Lydia watching him. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know it," he said. "You also didn't ask me first." He stopped. A shadow of something moved across his face. "No, I should have." "Yes," but she kept her voice level, because she could see he understood it genuinely and not as a matter of pride. "I appreciate that you answered at all. I just want to do my own answering, when there's answering to be done." "Fair," he said. "That's fair." He went to the coat rack and reached for his jacket, heading back out to the evening chores, and at the door he paused. "For what it's worth, I told him no because it's true, not to manage the talk." "I know," she said, and she did. Christmas came to Harlan's Crossing with 3 inches of snow and a church social that Lydia attended with Abel and Caleb because it would have been odder not to attend than to go. Reverend Hollis preached a sermon about the gifts we are given in unexpected packages, which Lydia suspected was pointed, and the congregation sang 2 hymns with the particular fervor of people who have been cold for weeks and find singing warming. Caleb held her hand through the hymns because, he explained, he kept losing his place in the hymnal, and she had better sight lines. This was not quite true, but she held his hand anyway. Walking back to the wagon in the quiet December dark, the snow muffling the sounds of Harlan's Crossing, Abel walked beside her and said nothing, which by now she had learned was his equivalent of comfortable company. The stars over Wyoming in December were preposterous. Too many, too bright, arranged without any apparent modesty. "My mother used to say a sky like this one was proof of extravagance," she said, without planning to. Abel looked up. "My wife used to say it was proof of showing off." They both stood there for a moment. Caleb had run ahead to the wagon. "She sounds like she was funny," Lydia said. She was, he said. She laughed more than anyone I've known. Do you? She stopped. It was not her question to ask. Do I miss her? He finished. Every day, less sharp now than it was. He looked at the sky a moment longer. But Caleb needs someone who takes him seriously, who answers his questions about rivers and China. He said it simply, without preamble or decoration. You do that. She did not answer immediately. She was thinking about what he'd said and what he hadn't. Abel, she said, I have a return ticket. I know it. I bought it before I came. I was always planning to go back. I know that too. He turned to look at her, and his face in the starlight was calm and direct. I'm not asking you anything tonight, Lydia. I wanted to say what I said. She nodded once. They walked to the wagon. It was January when Caleb confessed, with the cheerful gravity of a child who has been waiting for the right moment. He announced it at the supper table, between the biscuits and the beans, that he had taken the ticket from the green pouch and hidden it under the floorboard near the parlor window, and he said it in the same tone he might report that the well needed checking. Lydia set down her fork. Abel set down his. Caleb, Abel said. She was going to leave on the Thursday stage, Caleb said. I heard her tell Mr. Fillmore's secretary, before Christmas. She said she'd been reconsidering the arrangement. He looked at Lydia. Are you going to make me give it back? Lydia was quiet for a long moment. She looked at Caleb, who was watching her with his mother's steady dark eyes and not a trace of repentance. She looked at Abel, who was watching her with an expression that was doing its best to be unreadable and not entirely succeeding. Go get it, she said. Caleb slid off his chair and went to the parlor. They heard him lift the floorboard. He came back with the green ribbon pouch and placed it on the table in front of her. She looked at it. She picked it up. She could feel the stiff paper of the ticket through the fabric. She turned it in her hands for a long moment. Then she set it back down on the table and looked at Abel. I was reconsidering the arrangement, she said. That's true. He waited. I had been thinking that the year would end and I would go back to Cincinnati and find a proper school post and proceed with my life in the sensible direction. She folded her hands on the table. I had been thinking that very clearly right up until December. What happened in December, he said. It was not quite a question. You got up early and put a log on the stove, she said, and apparently you fixed my chair the first week. Something in his face shifted, that territory adjacent to a smile, wider now, not quite there but approaching. I want to stay, she said, not because of the ticket or because of the contract, because I want to, if that is something you would want. Abel was quiet for a moment. Outside, the January wind moved across the territory, pressing at the walls the way it always did, constant and factual. The fire in the stove ticked. Lydia, he said, I have wanted you to stay since the night you made stew with Rosemary from Cincinnati. She laughed, a real one, surprised out of her. It was not a sound she had made in this house before, and it seemed to startle all three of them pleasantly. Caleb looked between them with immense satisfaction. So she's staying, he said. Yes, Abel said. Good. Caleb picked up his biscuit. I told Mrs. Pruitt she was staying, back in November. Caleb, Lydia said. She asked me. Abel put his hand over his mouth. His shoulders shook once. Lydia looked at the green ribbon pouch on the table. She picked it up, drew the ticket out, and held it for one last moment, proof she was not staying, which she had carried from Cincinnati like a talisman against belonging somewhere. Then she folded it deliberately and set it on the edge of the stove's iron top, where the heat took it at once. The paper curled and was gone. Well, she said, that's settled. Abel Greer asked Lydia Cole to marry him in February, on a morning when the snow was still thick on the ground, but the light had changed. That particular late winter light that tells the land what is coming, whether the land is ready or not. He asked her in the front room, standing by the desk where she did the correspondence, and he did it plainly, the way he did everything. "I'd like us to make this permanent," he said, "not because of what people say, and not because of Caleb, though he'd be glad of it. Because I think we've built something here and I want to keep building it. With you." She had been expecting it, in the way you expect something you have been hoping for, with a particular careful hope that tries not to presume too much.
"Yes,"
she said. And then, because she was Lydia, "Though I should tell you I intend to keep the school. I'm a teacher." "I know what you are," he said. "That's not in question. And the correspondence is only fair wage for the room, so you'll owe me a proper wage after." His eyes were warm. "Done. And Caleb needs a shelf in his room for the books I'm going to keep giving him, because the floor is becoming a hazard. I'll build it this weekend." The almost smile was all the way there now, unhurried, completely his. "Any other terms?" she thought. "That's sufficient for now," she said. "I reserve the right to add conditions as they occur to me." "Naturally," he said. He took her hand, carefully, the way he did everything, with a steadiness that was its own kind of warmth, and held it. Nothing more than that, in the front room with the winter light coming through the east window. But it was enough. It was, in the accounting of two practical people who had both wanted more than the practical, exactly enough. Reverend Hollis married them on a Saturday in early March, just the four of them and the Reverend and Mrs. Hollis as witness, in the little church that smelled of pine and candle wax. Caleb stood beside his father and held the ring with both hands, and relinquished it at exactly the right moment, which Lydia suspected he had practiced. She wore her good blue dress and carried a small bunch of dried lavender that Abel had saved from summer for reasons he had not explained at the time. Later she would understand he had been hoping for this since October, since the night she sat down at his supper table and talked back to the evening like she intended to stay. After, walking out of the church into the March air that was cold still but different, lighter, moving differently, full of its own intention, Abel put his hand at the small of her back, and she let herself lean into it just slightly, the way you lean against something you trust to hold. Inside, she heard Caleb telling Reverend Hollis in great detail about the rivers of China, which he had recently been reading about, and Reverend Hollis was answering with the patience of a good man. The territory was wide and plain, and serious under the March sky, and the road back to the ranch stretched out ahead of them, familiar and not finished. There was a shelf to build, and spring correspondence to write, and a classroom full of children who asked excellent questions, and a kitchen that smelled of rosemary on the good evenings. There was, Lydia thought, quite a lot of life still to build. She was glad, down to the practical center of herself, that she was going to build it here. There is an old saying that a person does not choose the home that claims them. They simply wake up one day and find they have already begun belonging to it, through small acts they almost didn't notice. A stove log added in the dark, a chair leg quietly mended, a hand held through a hymnal. What Lydia Cole came west to do was teach, and she did that faithfully. What she did not plan was to be taught in return. That belonging is not a retreat from life, but the very ground that makes a good life possible. Abel Greer knew this in his bones, but had forgotten how to say it. Caleb, being 6, simply hid the evidence until the truth could catch up. Now, friend, here is the question I want to leave with you tonight. Has a small and ordinary act of care ever changed the direction of your life? Tell me about it in the comments. I would love to hear your story. And if you want more journeys into the Old West, where hearts are stubborn and love is patient and the sky is always wider than you expected, subscribe and stay a while. We'll have another story waiting for you. Good night. God bless you, and God bless everyone you carry home in your heart.